I welcome you to Ahmedabad University. We are a university who believe in a different kind of education, which is more experiential in nature, and we love to debate on topics, and we love to invite speakers who have deep views on topics which really matter the most in today's world. And that's why we are here today. And before that, I would like to extend a special thanks to Professor Jimo Lunni and for inviting Professor Sriram and suggesting this idea of having a webinar on this, a talk on this, because today's webinar is to commemorate the birth centenary of Dr. Verghese Kurian, and we all know his contribution to Indian uh, sector in every possible way, whether it is, you might say, father of white revolution, or a social entrepreneur whose billion liter idea created such a huge impact on people, whether it is in urban and rural and providing so much of employment. And again, related to that, it is the 75th years of Milk and Progress by Amul, and which provides at least close to 40 lakhs women farmers livelihood, and providing health, nutrition, and taste to a lot of people. So that was the context in which it was suggested by Professor G. Moludi to invite and have a conversation. So uh, that is the context in which we thought that it would be appropriate to call Professor Sri Ram. And we all know that Professor M.S. Sri Ram is the Distinguished Fellow of the Indian Institute for Development of Research in Banking and Technology, uh, an institute set up by the Reserve Bank of India. Before this, he worked as an independent consultant. Till March 2010, he was the ICICI Bank Lalita D. Gupte Chair Professor of Microfinance and Chairperson of Finance and Accounting Area at IIM Ahmedabad. Prior to working at IIM Ahmedabad, he was the first Vice President of Finance and Information at BASICS, the first commercial microfinance institution in India. He was on the faculty of the Indian Institute of Rural Management, Anand, IRMA, for 6 years. Professor Sriram did significant work on cooperatives when he was at IRMA, a large part of the work pertaining to agriculture credit cooperatives. He was a member of the Vaidyanathan Committee on Cooperative Reforms set up by the Government of India. And we are very happy to have Professor Sriram for this talk. So welcome to you, sir, for this, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
The person who will be in conversation with Professor M.S. Sriram is Professor Rahul Singh. Professor Rahul Singh is a faculty at Ahmedabad University in Amrit Modi School of Management, and he is an applied microeconomist, and his research interests lie in international trade, industrial organizations, and development economics. His research examines the firm level adjustment to non-tariff measures and Chinese import competition in the post-liberalization period in India. He holds a PhD in economics from IIM Bangalore, and recently he has won the BRICS Economic Research Award 2021 for his doctoral dissertation, Essays in International Trade in Post-Liberalization India. So we are happy to have both of you. Before I hand it over to Rahul, I would like to make few announcements. During this conversation, other people will be muted, and we request you to rename yourself if you have not renamed already. And these two people will be in conversation for the next 1 hour. During that conversation, we request other participants, if you have any questions, you can put your questions in everybody's chat box and we'll take it up. And at the end of the conversation, somewhere around 5:10 or 5:05, we'll take all these questions and address them. So that's all. Thank you so much. And thanks to both of you. Now I hand it over to Rahul to take it forward.
So first of all, thank you, Professor Sriram, for joining us today for the conversation series. All of us are looking forward to learning a lot about cooperatives. So to set things off, I thought just for the benefit of few of us who may not be aware of what cooperatives are, it would be great if you could, define cooperatives for us and some of the salient features of cooperatives and how they differ from the traditional, public and private companies. Just to start off. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Nice to see all of you, and thanks a lot. I think the conversation on cooperatives have increased in the last few months, partly because of Dr. Kurian's birth centenary and partly because of the new Ministry of Cooperatives that has been created. And therefore, a guy like me who was mothballed as far as cooperatives are concerned is finding new currency. But, jokes apart, your question about how are cooperatives different from mainstream organizations. the basic difference between cooperatives and mainstream business organizations is how they treat capital. That's all. I mean, basically, that's the basic stuff. And then there are other aspects which sort of make it a little more complicated because of the parameters that come around it. If you look at how cooperatives emerged and were to take a historical perspective, it emerged along with the Industrial Revolution. I mean, not that there were no cooperatives before that, but it actually strengthened around the Industrial Revolution. And cooperation or cooperatives is a form of response to capital-centric business. If you look at a typical capital-centric business, you're saying that every factor of production gets a fixed payoff, pre-contracted payoff. It might not be a fixed amount, but it's a pre-contracted payoff. And all the leftovers go to people who put the capital. And therefore, the primacy is capital. And the primacy of capital came up around Industrial Revolution because that's when you needed capital, because if you're looking at large infrastructure, mills and other things that were being built, the biggest constraint was capital at that point in time, unless the state itself invested, as in case of railways and some other public investments that the state made. So if it had to come from sources other than state, then it had to be given some sort of a place of primacy. And as a result of which, you look at the corporation also evolving around the Industrial Revolution, even though charters and other forms of organizations were there, but it really started evolving around the Industrial Revolution. And cooperatives came as a response to the corporation, saying that why should every activity be assuming that capital is the biggest constraint and therefore it needs to get a disproportionate amount of rent? What cooperatives did was they said, okay, let's treat capital as a factor of production and as one of the factors of production, give it a fixed payoff and have something else as central. So since we're talking of milk, what the typical argument in milk would be, it is not capital that is as absolutely essential, it is milk that is absolutely essential for you to run a dairy business. And therefore, you provide capital a rate of return, which is like a debt capital and a fixed pre-contracted rate of return. And whatever residue is there goes back to the producer of milk and consider milk as a constraint. So what cooperatives did was it shifted the centrality of capital from, centrality of the business or how it was designed from capital to something else. What that something else is defined by the nature of the cooperative. That's essentially.
Thank you. That was, I think, a lot of us would have now better clarity on what cooperatives are. So you have been involved and in your academic work with cooperatives. So I was very curious to, if you could speak for some time regarding your experience, how you were involved with cooperatives, in what capacity, and your work on it for a bit before we move on.
Sure. In fact, I started my work with cooperatives during my summer internship when I was doing my post-graduation in the Institute of Rural Management, where I studied. I went to this organization called Cooperative Development Foundation, which was later called Cooperative Development Foundation. Earlier, it was called Samakhya. And I interned in a multi-purpose cooperative in a village called Mulkanur in Karimnagar district of current Telangana, then the undivided Andhra Pradesh. That was my first exposure to cooperatives. And the idea of the organization where I was doing my summer internship was to replicate these cooperatives across Telangana and also Andhra Pradesh, because they were working in undivided, but most of their work was in what is now called Telangana. I eventually joined that organization because I thought that it was a very interesting way, and we were also greatly inspired by Kurian because I was in Anand, studying in Anand, so one got to hear him, not meet him. I mean, obviously, he was inaccessible as far as students were concerned, except that we used to get to hear him quite often, about 3 to 4 times a year. And he was a very inspiring and a compelling speaker and did talk about cooperatives. So therefore, we were all sort of evangelized into the concept of cooperation. And for me, it was interesting to move away from milk and look at something else. So that's how I went to Telangana. The idea of this cooperative institution was that they would promote more and more farmers cooperatives, and using that they would try and create a federation and so on. It also it's a very interesting thing because it dovetailed with water coming into those two districts of Karimnagar and Warangal. And they said if we strengthen the cooperatives here as the water is coming in, because there was a dam and a distributory canal being put up. The idea was as water comes, the cropping pattern changes and moves away from maize, which was erstwhile this thing, to paddy. So the idea was, can we create a buzz around making these cooperatives stronger so that when the farmers change the cropping pattern, they get a better return on their produce. That was the whole idea. So, by the way, it's interesting. It's interesting because I had to leave the organization because I had a fight with my bosses. And this was, it was for me, for them an ideological fight, for me a practical fight. What happened at that time was the management of all the agriculture, and this is a bane. I mean, there was this whole question of politicization, etc., that was asked. What happened was NTR, who came as the chief minister, I think in 1984 or no, 85, I think, came and took over all the cooperatives lock, stock and barrel. He had appointed administrators. And my organization said, what the hell is this? I mean, they are not following cooperative principles, which is democratic control, elected board, farmers representation, and so on. So they said, as long as you don't have that principle adhered to, it's not a cooperative. So therefore, we stop working with them. And my response was, if we start working with them, by the time you fight your fight, water would have already come in and private sector would have come in. So, you know, cooperatives would have lost out to the private rice millers. So that was a question of should we stick to the ideology or should we stick to the practical aspects of business? But yeah, I mean, in retrospect, I guess they were right and I was wrong. And then, of course, I continued working on the cooperatives for my thesis and later working, basically trying to look at what makes cooperatives work and why do cooperatives fail. Basically, that's been the nutshell of all my work as far as cooperatives are concerned.
Yeah, that's great for us because I think bulk of today's conversation would revolve around those two aspects. But before that, I think you have already started that discussion briefly, but I thought, you know, if you could take it further and talk about how cooperative movement has evolved, particularly in India. If I'm not wrong, the first legislation came in 1904 or so. So it's been over 100 years. So just a brief kind of, you know, plan as to how it has gone about and some comments on that.
So for some strange reason, cooperatives has been a part of the discourse of the state all the time. 1904, the first Cooperative Societies Act was passed. 1898, the cooperatives had already started coming in. 1904 was the first Cooperative Societies Act. 1915, they amended the act to have federations of cooperatives. 1928, the Royal Commission on Agriculture sort of looked at cooperation and so on. But the big push came when the All India Rural Credit Survey Committee submitted its report. That was, I think, 54 was when the commission was, committee was set up, and I think 56 is when they came out with the report. And that report basically said that they introduced a concept called state partnership with cooperatives. I mean, we've never had this concept of state partnership with corporates. We've had public sector organizations, which are state-owned. We have private sector organizations. Of late, we have had PPPs, but otherwise, these were two different silos, and there was a process of privatizing the public. Here, cooperatives are private institutions. For some strange reason, they're seen as an extension of the state. They're private institutions because the only difference between them and the corporate is the basis of distribution of profits. Nothing else is different, if you were to look at it. The second difference, of course, and that is the reason why the state comes in, is because capital-centric organizations operate on a principle of fungibility, and therefore you can transfer your shares. You can actually make capital central, and then those who have given the capital, you can give a proportionate right to vote, say in the governance and so on. So everything is around capital. In cooperatives, you move from capital, which is a fungible resource, to milk or consumer products or labor, which is a very specific resource. So I can't trade milk. I can't say that, sorry, I'm giving up my rights to supply milk to somebody else, unless it's a very closed loop organization. So therefore, in cooperatives, there's a concept of open membership, that you can come in whenever you have the ability to give the basic stuff for the cooperative. Because there's an open membership, your membership can come in and go, and therefore you don't have a long-term vote or a long-term stake. And also you can't determine your vote according to the proportion, because the proportion of goods supplied also varies from year to year. So as a result of which, came out with an easy solution. Let's have one person, one vote. That makes it very near, because it's democratic, it takes it very near a political organization while you're a business organization. I think that is the basic contradiction that is there in design.
Yeah, thank you. So before we move on to the dairy cooperatives and why they have been successful, I thought it would be worthwhile that we discuss in general about what have been the successes in the cooperative space, because they are varied different types of cooperatives. So if you could just tell us some of the examples of cooperatives that have been successful and point to some reasons, and we'll get to the dairy cooperatives.
Sorry, from your original question of how the cooperatives evolved, I diverted into the design of the cooperatives. I'm sorry. I mean, I'll get back to the how cooperatives evolved.
Sure, no issues.
Sometimes you get carried away by your own voice. That's a problem. So All India Rural Credit Service said state partnership with cooperatives, and as a result of which the state started investing in cooperatives. If you look at what has happened in the financial cooperatives, and there the objective was, these are financial cooperatives. Financial cooperatives essentially termed as credit cooperatives. The objective there was to get the poor farmers out of the clutches of the so-called evil moneylender. So they said All India Rural Credit Survey indicated that 92% of the rural population or rural households were indebted to informal sources. So it was a process of formalization, and they said cooperatives is a good idea. So by 1969, when you look at the All India Debt and Investment Survey that is done, 60 and later 1970 debt and investment, you see that the cooperatives have indeed taken a significant share of the rural credit market. But nevertheless, even though they were designed as financial cooperatives, which is thrift and credit, because it was state partnership and state was putting in a lot of capital, it turned out to be predominantly credit rather than savings and credit. That's one. Second, of course, because of the nature of agriculture, where there is covariant demand for investment during the sowing season, it also needed net credit rather than having a working on the principle of mission. That's one part of this. In 1960s, we got the dairy cooperative movement. I mean, 1948 was when Amul was set up, but by the setting up of the National Dairy Development Board, which was at the initiative of Lal Bahadur Shastri, who came to Gujarat and requested Kurian to replicate the Amul pattern throughout India. And that resulted in about 40 years of Operation Flood and the dairy cooperative movement. So these are two major movements that have come with some sort of a state partnership. One movement which has come without too much of a patronage of the state are the sugar cooperatives of Maharashtra. They just came up on their own and embedded themselves into the political system. It was not the political system promoting them. It was seen as a stepping stone for politics rather than the politics seeing them as a thing. Whereas in case of Operation Flood, it was not politics, it was much more of design, bureaucrats, and a collaborative exercise. In case of credit cooperatives, it was much more of a policy push. I think you can see these as three different models. There have been other cooperatives. Kerala has a builders cooperative. Your coffee board, for instance, your Indian coffee house is a workers cooperative. Not many people know that it's a workers cooperative, and not many people also know that it is located in Jabalpur, and it looks as if it is coming right out of Kerala, because a whole lot of people, workers there are from Kerala, but its headquarters is in Jabalpur, and it has some 13 or 14 cooperatives under its this thing, and each one of those are independent cooperatives. So a whole lot of interesting cooperatives have come all across the country.
So just to add to that point, so I had this, so this is a layman's observation that it just seems to me that cooperatives in the the distribution and on the where they try to link producers to consumers, they have been somehow more successful than cooperatives who have been part of the trying to sort out issues on the supply chain side of things, trying to get raw materials at cheaper prices. Or am I wrong? I mean, that's so. For example, the Indian Coffee House, Amul, we have so many examples of cooperatives like that. But am I wrong, or is it the case that these cooperatives functioning on this side of the business are more successful, or is it not the case? We have examples on all types of cooperatives being successful.
Rahul, every time you try to make a generalization, there is something else that says, oh, well, is this generalization valid or not? I have struggled with this a lot. One of the things that I would expect, by going by the principles of design, if you were to go by the principles of design, wherein you're saying this should not be capital centric, it should be transaction centric, right? I mean, if that is the principle of design, then there should be no, a typical capital centric activity is likely to find it difficult to survive, because you need the capital. Direct cooperatives all sudden are capital centric. If you go, as long as you're looking at just the procurement function, it is fine. The moment you move into processing, they're capital centric. That only aggregation, it is turnover centric, right? So I'm amazed as to how capital centric organizations, cooperatives with so much of capital requirement are successful. And if you unpack them, you would see that there's a lot of government grant and other things that come in to pad up the requirement of capital. That is one part of it. Second is, for example, if it is activity centric, right? I would think that all the IT firms should have been cooperatives, because they don't need, particularly if you're an IT services firm, right? The only capital that you need is that fancy building that they sit in, and possibly the computer systems and other things. But you are completely driven by intellect. You're completely driven by the contribution, and therefore your most important resource there is the human resource of people who are working in the technical jobs. So I would think that the IT related stuff, particularly the consulting project sort of IT, should have been cooperatives. I've not seen a single IT related firm which is cooperative. So the moment we try to generalize, in practice we find that there is a lovely exception of things working something other way, which defies all the design. And I think the way that has been squared up is by trying to sort of work around the principles of cooperatives and work around the constraints that it gives and innovate on the organizational design. If you look at Amul, if you look at any of these, they've innovated on how they address the issue of capital, how they address the issue of this. Similarly, in the corporate world also, you've tried to innovate on employee long-term stakes by giving ESOPs, sweat equity, a whole lot of things in that framework as well. So yeah, I don't think any of these designs are cast in stone. They evolve.
So just before we move to the White Revolution and the success of dairy cooperatives, one example, if you could, of the credit cooperatives that have been very successful, or we have some historical examples, and one from agriculture, if you have some cooperative in mind, before we transition to dairy.
Yeah. Look, credit unions have been successful across the world. If you take Rabobank, for instance, or Desjardins, Canada, or Credit Agricole. You have internationally many credit and savings. These are SACCOs, savings and credit cooperatives, as they're called. So they're ideally, this is what amazes me. You are saying that this is a concept that came challenging the centricity of capital, and they're successful in something which deals with capital all the time. Both it's money, right? The logic for that possibly is because of the principle of mutuality, that you're working together, and therefore you have a greater information about your peers. And therefore the information asymmetry which a lender and a borrower has is done away with in a community-owned institution, because you know your community people. Therefore, you're able to reduce the leverage that somebody takes and chop off costs on both ways. That's why possibly SACCOs are this thing, they're able to pay a higher savings, rate of interest on savings and charge a lesser rate of interest on this scheme, because they don't have the information asymmetry and they gain by that, right? That's one, because of community. So these organizations are successful only when they federate. And therefore you look at them and say that, look, none of these have lost the ground level connect, and they continue to be community owned organizations. Whereas you'll still see them as international organizations because they have promoted a federation, and that I would not call as a cooperative. That I would call as an organization owned by a cooperative. Whether it's Desjardins, which is an international bank, largest in Quebec province and 5th largest in Canada, AAA rated and so on. I think the federation is, even though it's a federation of cooperatives and called a cooperative, it functions not like a cooperative but like a bank, but owned by cooperatives, and services back the cooperatives and the members, right? So there are success stories. In India also, we have very successful financial cooperatives that are there, including in the urban cooperative sector. That's there. On the agricultural cooperatives also, there have been success stories. And in fact, it is very difficult for you to distinguish between an agricultural cooperative and a financial cooperative in the rural area. What happens is, because of the All India Rural Credit Survey and state partnership, what they did in the initial days when they were refinancing, they said your agricultural loans would have three components: a cash component, A, B, and C. A cash component, a kind component, and a service component, agricultural extension component, right? So therefore, most of these cooperatives, and that's the Mulkanur story. The Mulkanur story is that it is a financial cooperative. It depends on the savings of the members. It gives loans to the members. But what it does is, while it could leverage, let's say, if member puts 100 rupee share, the member can get 1,000 rupee loan. It can leverage 10 times, right? What the cooperative said was, they told the members, we'll leverage you only 5 times. So I'll only give you 50 rupees if you're giving a 10 rupee share. And then use the other 50 while they continue to borrow 10 times, and use the other 50 to buy fertilizers, seeds, and other activities. So organizations which have succeeded in rural areas, because rural areas suffer from covariant risk, and geographical concentration risk. All of them, if there is a drought, it affects everybody, and everybody is an agriculturist, so it affects the entire crop. So one way they balance this out is to have a lot of non-credit businesses, which gives them margin-based income sources, and that's how they buffer it up. So there's one in West Bengal called Sridharpur. That's a very successful call. Kolhapur area is splintered with cooperatives, which are very, very extremely successful, multi-purpose.
Thank you. That is very insightful, some of the examples. Now to the dairy cooperatives and the white revolution. So I would request you to basically chart out the legacy of Dr. Verghese Kurian with relation to, although he has done a lot more outside of the white revolution, I would, if you could start with the white revolution and his role in it and its legacy. Yeah.
Sure. This would be a slightly longer answer, so I'll take about 10 minutes.
Absolutely.
Deal with this.
In fact, 15 would be fine here.
Yeah. Okay. On the white revolution, it's an interesting thing because it was a good 25 years after Amul started that we started the process of white revolution. Amul started in 1948 or 46, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. I might get the dates wrong by a year or two. Unpardonable, but pardon me for that. 46, yeah. So by the time Shastriji came to Anand and he said we need to replicate this, Amul had already established the possibility of a crop. But if you look at the evolution of Amul, it's a very, very interesting and a gradual evolution. They started by collecting milk, They eventually set up a processing plant. They started with a creamery and then started adding products. For a long time, Amul was not marketing milk on its own. Till about mid-70s, the marketing of Amul's product to Mumbai was being done by Voltas, a Tata company. It's a very interesting thing. I mean, you would think that a cooperative would not work with a corporate, but it was working completely in collaboration with the corporate, saying that, look, distribution is not our forte, marketing is not our forte. So that was Amul for them. And they developed the brand. They developed actually two brands. Anand-based cooperative developed a brand called Amul, which sort of broadly translated to Anand Milk Union Limited, even though it was never called Anand Milk Union Limited. It was always called Kheda District Cooperative Milk Producers Union Limited, KDCMPUL, but loosely translated to Amul. And Mehsana, which was the next biggest producer and later became the largest producer of milk, had its own brand called Sagar. And the other dairy cooperatives had their own local brands. Baroda had something called Sugam, Surat had something called Amul, Valsad had something called Vasudhara, and so on. But ultimately, it all got captured under the Amul umbrella. So that was a village level cooperative, federating at a dairy level union, which processes milk. And eventually, by 70s, they said we need a federation which will market milk. I mean, that's where the Gujarat Cooperative Milk Marketing Federation got to be set up, right? That was the Amul model. When Shastriji came and asked Dr. Kurian, he said, look, we could do this, but he had two conditions. One was that the headquarters of this dairy board would be in Anand and not in Delhi. He basically said, I don't want any of your babus and netas to breathe down my neck. I mean, he was very blunt about all these things and he could get away with all these stuff because it was so good. Second, he said, I don't want any money from you. I'll find my own money. It will be, so therefore, if you look at the early days of NDDB and the way it was set up, it was not subject to CAG audit. It was not subject to a whole lot of things. It was, Dr. Kurian was the emperor of whatever it was. That autonomy helped him to do a whole lot of things which would not have been possible under the proper bureaucratic requirements that you need to do. But was he accountable? Of course he was accountable, because there was transparency, there was accountability, there were questions raised about it. I'll come to that later. Now, what did Kurian do? Kurian said, okay, I don't need any money, but I will seek aid. And at that time, there was a glut in the European market. So therefore, he went and worked with the FAO and the European market to get the excess milk powder and butter oil from Europe and use that to... the logic Dr. Kurian said was, unless there is a Mumbai, there is no Anand. So unless you find a market, there is no point in looking at, developing the milk production and cooperativizing. Where are you going to sell? You need to develop the market as well. So it was an interesting thing. People at that time asked Kurian, are you not being used by the European Union? After all, they will come and give you free aid. And there's always this question about international aid. And first they'll give you aid and then they'll occupy your markets and so on. And Kurian, and like Yunus, in fact, I asked this question of Yunus also when he tied up with Garmin Danone, with Danone for his Garmin Danone this thing. Don't you think they're using you? Kurian turned around and said, why do you think so? I'm using them actually. Why should they use me? You think I'm a stupid guy to be used by somebody? I'm using them. So Yunus also said the same thing. He said, why do you think Danone is using me? I'm using them. My name is first and Danone's name is later. Anyway, let's park it there. So what he did was very interesting, because the first phase of Operation Flood was developing the 4 metro markets. Chennai, Mumbai, Calcutta, and Delhi. And as they developed the markets, they said there will be a demand pull, and therefore it will become very interesting for the supply push to happen, right? So that was the design. Then there was this, they said that if Amul took 25 years to stabilize, can we do it faster? Which means that Amul was organized by local people, then it got replicated, word of mouth, more this thing and so on. So what they did was, in the dairy board, they set up what is called the spirit teams. the spirit teams would go and encourage people to set up cooperatives. If you have seen the film Manthan, Manthan is a spirit team. I mean, that Girish Karnad, the characters of Girish Karnad, Anant Nag, and all these, I think there's two or three more people. There's a veterinarian, there's a, that is a team of 4 or 5 which would go and stay in a village and help them to set up a cooperative, set up things, milk testing, things like that, and then link them up to a market. So this was done by the free money that came in the form of commodity aid, which was realized by selling milk in the markets. That became the corpus of Dairy Board, and that was used to develop these supply chains, right? What did Dairy Board do? Dairy Board would ask the cooperatives to generate their own capital, but give possibly a 60-40 share, soft loans, grants to the dairy unions, which are basically processing units, and then allow the state unions or state governments to set up autonomous cooperatives with their own brands. So Karnataka has Nandini, your Tamil Nadu is Avin, Andhra Pradesh is Vijaya, and so on. I mean, Saras and Sudha and a whole lot of things. So the idea was to replicate the Amul model across the country. And Operation Flood 2, 3, and 4 were taking it to more and more milk sheds. Now, there are 2 other things. I mean, in fact, Professor Ashok Gulati keeps talking when he's in the context of the farm laws. He says farmers, producer organizations, and Amul is an example for the agricultural sector to follow. But if we were to follow Amul as an example, or the milk as an example, we need to make an investment of 40 years. And it was, while it used market principles, please remember it did not use market principles for a whole lot of things. In the early days of Amul, there was a veterinary route that would go every week to every village. That is to ensure that there is no productivity loss because of animals falling sick. There was cattle feed being supplied at subsidized rates. There was artificial insemination being done free, right? A whole lot of things were done, and when the veterinary routes went, for the members of the cooperative, the medicines were free. In fact, when Dr. Tribundas, Mr. Tribundas Patel retired and Amul stepped down as chairman of Amul, he was the farmer leader, a person whom Dr. Kurian used to greatly admire because he was the one who gave Kurian his first job. When Tribundas Patel retired, Amul gave him a purse of 6 lakh rupees as a parting gift. Tribundas Patel went and set up a foundation called Tribundas Foundation, and the original objective of the foundation was to have medical facilities for human beings in Kheda district on par with the animals medical facility, because at that time, there was radio, you could, if an animal was sick, you could use the radio, wireless set to call a doctor in emergency to take care of an animal. And every week the doctor would go, right? So a lot of things happened which increase the productivity, increase the viability for the farmer. Now you don't need, because the farmer can go and get his cow or buffalo to a veterinary center because the ecosystem has developed. So this took about 40-50 years in all the states. I mean, this was replicated in all the states. Free artificial insemination or artificial insemination at a nominal price, free veterinary aid, etc., so that breed would improve. Whatever breed you have, productivity would continue. You don't miss anything. The only interesting thing that Dr. Kurian did not do, which was very surprising, was he never linked up the credit markets with the dairy market. Though I keep, since I work on banking, I keep saying that this is the most nearest dovetailing that you could do, because the payments happen on a daily basis and you need cash management. And there was no bank and cooperative, even the cooperative bank collaboration on either payment systems or on loans for buffaloes or loans for cows or loans for livestock. There's a reason for that, but I'll sort of leave it for a later question. I'll leave that as a suspense. This was how the dairy cooperative movement evolved. Now here, I'm not sure whether Dr. Kurian was very keen on cooperative principles or he was okay with being as practical as I was when I was younger. Because several state cooperative federations did not follow the principle of democracy. They had IAS officers heading federations and so on. he would make a noise about it, but he would not stop working with them. He would not have any penal action against state governments. So in one sense, I guess if I go back and look at Dr. Kurian's life, I think I have no doubt that he had the interest of the farmer in his heart. Whether that had to be done only through the cooperatives, I'm not sure he actually believed in it. He thought that cooperatives was a good instrumentality for practical purposes for dealing with this thing. But if there was an alternative way of reaching better resource to the farmer, I think back of his mind, he was okay with it, but I don't think he explicitly said that. I mean, that's my reading. When I look back at his life, I might be completely wrong. Obviously, I'll be trolled for having said this.
That was great. I learned a lot of new things about Verghese Kurian there. So one thing, I think one person, I was doing a little bit of reading, and one thing I found fascinating was that, I mean, it was pre-Amul, I think, when there was this person associated with Verghese Kurian, that was the name of Harish Dalaya, who was actually, so he found a very innovative way, because buffaloes were the predominant, cattle here in India, to make skim milk powder from buffalo milk, and that enabled Amul to outcompete even Nestle in India at that point of time.
Yeah, I mean, the role of Dalaya as a technical expert who's working with Kurian is very understated. He was very, very important. I think there are two more things which are interesting. One is we could not make cheese out of buffalo milk. We did not have the technology. We could not make milk powder out of this thing because buffalo milk was this thing, and the technology was with Nestle. Dr. Kurian went to Switzerland and asked Nestle, and obviously the terms that they offer was not acceptable to him. He came back and said, "To hell with you," and in his usual brash style, he said, "We don't want any Nestle." So part of it was Mr. Dalaya, and a major part of this technology was developed by Central Food Technological Research Institute in Mysore, CFTRI. They were the ones who worked on this. Kurian gave this as an assignment or a challenge to them, and they were the ones who worked on this, and the technology did come back. I mean, it's a very, very innovative institute. It's done a lot of things for food technology, and also I think there's a DR defense establishment, one of the DRDOs, which looks at packaging and other things. So between these institutions, the technology is completely indigenously developed. That's the most interesting part. Yeah, that's true.
Now, I think in the interest of time, we should move to the evaluating how the cooperative movement has worked. So I just wanted you to kind of give us some sense of what the empirical evidence suggests. So I just glanced briefly. It turns out that almost 29 crore Indians are in some way or the other directly connected to one cooperative or the other. That is like 1 in 4, if I'm not wrong. So what does the empirical evidence tell us about? Has the cooperative movement really benefited especially the rural population? So, compared to people who are not engaged in cooperatives vis-a-vis people who are engaged. Is there some work and some thoughts on that?
I mean, there is lot of work, but the question is, has cooperative as a form of organization succeeded? And my answer is, by design, it is difficult for a cooperative organization to succeed. I mean, prima facie. Why? Because it has internally contradictory principles on which it operates. It operates on a democratic principle. It rewards the highest supplier of this thing. And even if it needs capital, it treats capital with disdain and with fixed payoff, right? So these three are, and therefore it tends to be managed like a political institution, because you have one person, one vote, irrespective of what your skin in the game is. So I'm not surprised that there is a political capture of cooperatives, because if it's one person, one vote, the guys who can master the management of a one person, one vote institution are the politicians. Why are we surprised that the politics is taking over cooperatives? And I mean, it's designed for the politicians to take over, as I say. So if the cooperatives have succeeded, and you look at all the literature as to why the cooperatives have succeeded, they've insulated themselves against one of these principles by creating some sort of an artificial barrier, which is in the interest of the core principle, right? Even your new generation cooperatives or the producer companies, which the dairy board is promoting, they're now saying, well, your categorization of membership is dependent on the patronage. You know, if you're pouring 50 liters of milk versus 500 liters of milk, the 500-liter guy gets a different category and 50-liter guy gets a different category, and there will be a representation from all the categories so that, you know, it is not very, it doesn't become an elite capture. So people are working around the democratic principle to see how it can be tuned to make it better fitting in a business setting. That's the one thing. Second is, what is the success of a cooperative? Rahul, the success of a cooperative is, has it given the maximum returns to the person who for which it has been formed? You know, he's a milk producer getting. Unfortunately, we tend to evaluate cooperatives as whether it's socially good, etc., etc. That is not the purpose of the cooperative. In fact, there's one very interesting paper that was written by Shanti George and Bhaviskar in the mid-80s, wherein they said that the success of Amul is also the failure of Amul. Now, there's a contradiction there. What was this thing? Their argument was, because Amul has been so successful in compensating the milk producers are not retaining enough milk in their respective homes, and there is malnutrition within the family. They're not getting enough protein, right? Because they're converting that into cash, and cash being fungible can be used for anything else, and it possibly need not necessarily get back to nutrition. I mean, that was the argument that they had made. And they attributed it to the economic success of Amul. Right? Now, if you look at it from a nutritional lens, obviously it's a terrible thing. And a recent study by Ila Bhatt, there's a book called Anugyan, where she looks at the Gandhian economy, philosophy of village economy. And she says, how do we interpret village economy in the modern day? And she says, there's a 100-mile radius that we draw around the village, and look at 4 or 5 essential services: food, clothing, shelter, banking, education, and healthcare. And are these coming from the local economy, or are these coming from the far off? So she's reinterpreting what a village economy is in the modern day. And her finding is, well, there is a lot of production of milk. It goes out and comes back as a packet back to the village with fat skimmed away. And then it comes back as a ghee bottle, right? So that is a paradox that we are living in. So that, so therefore, is a cooperative economic success? Yes, we have all these, sugar cooperatives, Amul, etc., which are economically successful to the extent that they have a limited purpose of maximizing returns of the milk producers. If you're limiting at that, they are successful. Otherwise, if you put other lenses, obviously, there are questions.
All right, so I think now we can get to some, identifying some of the reasons why some of the cooperatives have not done well, or maybe have failed. So I think we already touched upon that they are very prone to political influence by their very structure. Is technology adoption and management quality, these two things keep coming up in discussions on cooperatives? How salient are they, or is it just an academic discussion, or those are really important? There is a problem.
No, they are salient. For example, let me give you an alternative example. Suppose you are a shareholder of a corporation. What do? You operate as a shareholder of a corporation. If you're a significant shareholder, you might want to get onto the board and look at the oversight of a corporation through the board, right? And you delegate it to the technological professional people, right? There are a hierarchy of checks and balances, both outside of the corporation, which is the stock market, which gives you signals on whether the corporation is doing fine or not. You have a hierarchy of organizational hierarchy. Then you have independent research analysts, people who track your company and so on. So you have a whole range of information that is coming to you on a natural basis to manage that corporation, right? If I were a farmer and you asked me to get on to the board of, let's say, Amul, right? and I were to do the governance function also in addition to becoming a milk supplier, do I have the bandwidth and the technological capability to do this governance function? I might have the technological capability, I might not have the bandwidth. I have 1,000 other things to do in my own life, right? I might have the time, but I might not understand what this is, right? So what happens is, as organizations become more and more sophisticated in their technology and very capital intensive and very technology intensive, how would I take an informed decision on whether to put this money in a cheese plant or an ice cream plant or a milk powder or a ghee plant, right? Then what happens is, at the governance level, the power equation between the people who are at the governance and the technocrats becomes asymmetrical. The technocrats take over. In fact, it's classically seen in Dr. Kurian himself. Kurian was not a farmer. Kurian was a technocrat. He actually dictated the destiny of several of the cooperatives by being the chairman of the Gujarat Cooperative Milk Marketing Federation while he was not a farmer, right? So we can say that, yeah, he meant well, interest of the farmers. That's true. That's indeed true. But as long as he was there, the elected members were sort of, deferring to his technical decision, saying that you know best what is good for you. That's not a good governance hierarchy to have. It's a good governance hierarchy to have if you know that the person who's wielding the power is an inherently good-natured, non-corrupt, good person, like Dr. Kurian. So, therefore, the more you get into technology, the more you're going into capital-centric organization-like features, and you're losing the mutuality of a cooperative. Should you? I mean, and that's the Hobson's choice of the cooperative. The moment you are a cooperative and you want to grow, the growth takes you towards features which are not cooperative, features which are corporation-like, right? So if you are a commercial success, you're an ideological failure. If you're an ideological success, you will never be a commercial, success. So that is a contradiction of cooperatives. The second thing, Rahul, we need to understand is, should we shed tears? For me, if, for example, Amul came in because the milk producers were being exploited, and Amul has created an ecosystem where the milk producers can never be exploited because of competition, its purpose is over. Now it doesn't matter whether Amul remains a cooperative or a corporation or what it is, right? It doesn't matter if it has a corporate nature, because ultimately are the farmers getting good price? By association with Amul, that's what they were looking for, right? So, I mean, this 20 years ago, if I had told this, I would have said this guy is mad. But over a period of time, I've sort of learned to be less ideological and more analytical about these stuff.
That's great. That's very insightful. So last question will be to, if you could just explain to us what you see, in terms of what the government's role should be. Because as you started off the discussion today by saying that, the government has come up with a new ministry on cooperatives. So how do you see the government playing a role in sustaining the cooperatives? And also, if you could, for a minute or two, talk about what adjustments that cooperatives, I know generalizing is difficult, but some adjustments that cooperatives need to make on their own to, in the next 2 decades, 3 decades or so.
See, I don't think the government can do anything about business. I mean, it can create an ecosystem, it can remove hurdles, it can create a regulatory, non-interfering, but a regulatory infrastructure which allows you to have a recourse. I think we have a fairly good corporate law, corporate governance system with SEBI, with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs and so on. We need that sort of a hands-off and non-discriminatory regulatory architecture for cooperatives. I mean, that's possibly that's what we need. Do we have that? I think we have that partly because of the producer companies bill that was that added a chapter in the Companies Act, which allows cooperatives to register themselves as producer companies, and several cooperative, state governments passing the Liberal Cooperative Societies Act, Mutually Aided Cooperative Societies Act, and the likes. Now, till these acts came in, all these happened from mid-80s till late 90s. Till these acts came in, the cooperative ideologues, and fundamentalists like people like me were arguing that the problem with the cooperative sector is the government and the interference of the government. And if we get the government off our back, the cooperatives will survive. Now, we have had 2 decades of liberal laws. That should have set up a very vibrant cooperative system in this country. It is not. It is not essentially because, as I told you, the cooperative system is a complicated system, which says that I need capital, but I will not reward capital. I need produce, but I will not give you excess voting rights. And I will run on a democratic basis. So these are 3 completely internally contradictory principles. Now, you need to square these up. The only cooperatives which have squared this up fairly well are the sugar cooperatives. Why have they squared this up well? That's because sugar by nature is a perishable commodity where you can't store sugarcane for more than 24 hours. It will lose its productivity. So therefore, the sugar mill has to operate within a limited area, catchment area. So, and within that limited catchment area, most of them have to be members for the sugar. So in a way, it becomes like a company where company is closed and you add new members only at the exit of an existing member. Similarly, sugar cooperatives can get a new member only if an existing member vacates or some acreage goes out. So there they have been able to square this up because it's a closed loop cooperative. And then you can link up your supply rights to capital. You can say that, oh, you want to give 2 acres of sugarcane work to me, you give me 2 lakh rupees of share capital, otherwise, So that is aligned. So if you're able to align it, it's possible. Otherwise, it is always a contradiction. It's a problem.
So I think we are out of time. I think we can move to the Q&A. We look forward to some very interesting questions for Professor Sriram. So I'll hand it over to Professor Sudhir to start the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you to both of you. Thanks, Rahul. Our Vice Chancellor, Professor Pankaj Chandra, is here, so I would like to invite him to make some comments.
Well, thank you, Sudhir. And well, what a pleasure to hear Sriram. I don't think anyone here can find a better raconteur on what links fundamental thoughts behind formation of cooperatives, credit, and its large market or lack of market ideology, whichever way you do. So thank you so much for such a for weaving such a rich analysis. I think you can see probably how complex an analysis of a cooperative structure like Amul definitely is. But I just wanted to add, I like very much, Sriram, your comments on what is fundamental. Suppose today one is asked a question, what is it that you would want to protect in Amul, in this network? I think you answered that question. You answered that question by saying, in my mind, you would protect whether the farmers who are a part of it really get benefits that they deserve and more, rather than it being a cooperative structure or any other structure for that matter. So, and that organization form, by the way, is quite visible in many other countries as well. I saw when we were doing our Amul work in late 90s and early 2000, Devnath and I saw Amul as an organization where small firms come together to act like a large firm. And this was a governing structure. There was a great play of technology, and you talked about Dalay's contribution and CF Terai, because that was what allowed the storage of powder milk, and the summer season could be served very well with the flush season of the winter. The supply chain that it developed, which was very tight and extensive, the productivity that it obtained in many of its plants and so on and so forth. And if you look at an example like Tama, which is the Tokyo Advanced Metropolitan Area in Japan, or the Wenzhou in China, they actually achieve almost similar kind of outcomes. Of course, they're not necessarily within quote ideologically cooperatives. So there's something in this organizational form which I think which brings credit, returns to the farmer, to the producer, and you commented on Kurian's belief on the market, that to make it succeed. You know, one of the things that really struck my attention was how when GCMMF came up, how much of GCMMF's revenues, profits actually went back to the farmer in variety of different ways. And I thought that was very unique. A farmer not only gets money when they pour milk, they not only get services to maintain their business in a far more effective manner, but actually for every bottle of a pouch of milk sold and profit made, there's a fraction that comes back to them again, which really was very unique vis-a-vis many other similar examples globally. When I was listening to you, I was wondering what might be interesting mechanisms there to prevent it from failing. You know, and that you might perhaps know much. You'll definitely have far more deeper insight than others, because as free trade agreements come, things open up. I know that every now and then there's a pressure from New Zealand and many other countries to open up the dairy industry of India, and there's some bulwark that prevents it, but I don't know what's going to happen. But today, of course, the value-added products are there, the milk, the entire supply chain is very much part of this one organization. And I think of it truly during the pandemic. Ravi reminded me to mention this, but I think of this as a platform that Oxford really could use to develop their own vaccine so shortly. If you think about it, when the entire logistics system of the country had failed, there was only one organization that was delivering every 20 minutes across the cities, and that was Amul. You know, because the supply chain, the system of processes, and the profitability went up during that period phenomenally. So there's something in this organizational form that is that's valuable. And you pointed many of them, but I'm quite sure there are others that link into.
I don't know. I mean, let me try and respond. I don't know whether you expected a response for this or not.
No. I mean, I'm hear your thoughts on it. I mean, whatever, or a different one. But
I mean, it's it depends on how you define success, Pankaj, and how you define a failure. I mean, if you are a purist, you'll already declare Amul as a failure, ideological failure. I'll tell you why. You said that for every liter of milk that they sell, the farmer gets back. Now, for every pouch of milk that they sell, the Gujarati farmer gets back.
oh,
They're procuring milk from outside of Gujarat and selling outside of Gujarat. And when they're procuring milk from outside of Gujarat and selling outside of Gujarat, they're not a cooperative there in that location, because they're a Gujarat cooperative milk marketing. Now, here is a dilemma for somebody who's heading Amul, that look, my market is growing and I need to continue to maintain my market share, right? I have my ability to collect milk out of my catchment area is plateaued out. So I'm not getting additional members and I'm not getting additional milk. I'm getting it. I mean, I'm getting it, but it's the growth of my procurement in my catchment area is slower than my ability to sell. Now, my dilemma is, do I continue to occupy those markets, or do I say that I will not grow? If I don't grow, then my brand shrinks and my significance in the market goes down. If I grow, then actually I'm growing outside of my membership. So as a cooperative, it's a very big dilemma. So if you look at last 6 years of Kurian's chairmanship of DCMMF, it had plateaued out. And after Kurian left, it sort of started going up. One can argue that Kurian during his last 6 years, 6-7 years, had lost his sharpness. He overstayed. I mean, there are all these criticisms against him, but possibly he did not want to go out of Gujarat. I don't know. We don't know whether that was a conscious choice, whether it was this. Now, that's one part of Amul, which is a very interesting dilemma. And if somebody asks, what would you have done? I don't think I would have done anything other than what Sodhi has done right now. Because you're on a treadmill. You can't get off that treadmill. I mean, so I don't think there is a way out. The second question, Pankaj, is whether they'll be able to withstand the competition. I think they will be. As an organization, they will be, because they've made significant investments across the value chain. What's amazing is that the investment that they made at the farm level, milking machines, bulk milk coolers at the village, insulated tankers, they've completely kept in touch with technology as the technology is evolving. They're not a moribund institution. So therefore, they'll be able to, nobody will be able to match this sort of a supply chain, because the amount of investments that they'll have to make as a fresh organization is just unparalleled. It cannot be matched with the lifetime investments that Amul has made and are continuing to make. So it's in safe hands. The only danger is its governance system strong enough, or will the governance system cave in? Because your vote comes from the cooperative society. From cooperative, it goes to the union. From union, it goes to the federation. It is an indirect way. So will that accountability still be there? That is the only weak link, if there is any. Mr. Myra wants to ask a question. Sorry. Sir, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. Sriram, this is the second time in less than a month that you've educated me so profoundly. The previous time was when you helped me to understand the problems in the financial world by sharing with me the cooperatives, let me say, in the financial sector and why they run into trouble. It was really, really insightful. Today, you talked about the cooperative sector itself, the production cooperative and selling cooperative, not the financial side of it. And you mentioned that, in fact, Dr. Kurian seemed to have kept both apart. And yes, maybe practically for some reason, he kept them apart. So I'm going to be asking a question to you and perhaps Pankaj also. You're both masters of designing management organizations and enterprises. It's a design question. You clarified for me that being very clear about the purpose of the enterprise at the beginning and throughout is most important. What is this enterprise, the cooperative, set up for? Who, and what benefits for whom is it supposed to maximize? One can say it should maximize the economic benefits for the people who are producers. But Ila-Ben has pointed out, and you too, that actually doesn't improve their well-being. It may put more money into their banks, but doesn't improve their well-being. When you talk about for whose benefit, is not just whose benefit, but what benefit to those people should also be clear when you are running that enterprise. But this is where the complications start. And you mentioned that it's the internal contradictions between the various objectives of the cooperative that make it very hard to govern. Now, isn't this the problem that we are having in the entire corporate world, that we've oversimplified and made it easy to manage by saying that you manage to produce further financial surpluses out of the corporation, and then it's a very good corporation. And then those financial surpluses are available to do more things with. But the process of producing the financial surpluses is actually causing greater harm to the well-being of the planet and to society. So rather than expecting the SDGs and some godlike organization of the whole universe to tell us how to balance these things, every enterprise, as it lives, as it works, must continue to balance all the objectives that it has to meet, which is difficult, as we are saying. But that is, I think, what we need to learn to do. And there is already a clue. When we've been asking corporations for the last so many years that you need to use a balanced scorecard, they do resist, because it's difficult to balance three things. You want to know which is the most supreme. If I do care for the environment and society, will my returns improve over a long term? So you're already stating what you believe is the long-term purpose of the enterprise by the way you measure it. And similarly for economies, if you say GDP is the objective, and when we get a large enough GDP, we'll then worry about education and health. It's easier because you can focus on doing things to make it easy to do business, for example. So I'm thinking that actually it's the clue is how to design the governance, the decision-making within the enterprise, and put better decision-making processes, appropriate decision-making processes, and then train people to use those processes. And there'll be different processes for different objectives. But the success of the enterprise will be measured by, let me call it, a balanced scorecard. And a balanced scorecard means you should not attempt to make it into a single number, because the weightages to given to the different things will vary over time. When one thing seems to be falling behind, like the environment, you pay more attention. But you can't just care for the environment at that time, which we seem to be doing when saying, let's make it net zero, carbon net zero. We may kill more people in the process of achieving that objective. So, the boat tilts the other way, and first people getting thrown off on this side, then people on the other side are getting thrown off. And by people, I mean in terms of the health of the system. So what is the progress we can make? I'm asking our academic leaders here in focusing on governance and decision-making processes of an enterprise. And it won't be one standard model. I mean, it'll be a standard model perhaps, but there won't be one standard form of it. And I'm coming to what you mentioned, really the penny dropped when you mentioned Ela Ben Butt. When you have to consider the effects of your actions on a variety of different things, like the environment and the condition of society around and so on. And you mentioned, the information is available from the financial market about how you're doing financially. The whole institutions are set up. We don't have institutional setups to tell us how we are affecting the environment, how we're affecting our society just around ourselves and so on. So if you are going to be looking at just your village area, as Ela Ben Butt says, I mean, your signals and information is available to you without having to be, metric and measured and so on. And it comes back to, I'm taking a leap here into, we call it the Gandhian model. Yeah, it's a self-governing community in which people are doing different things. So at levels, each enterprise is doing what it has to do, what it's focused on. Some are more economic, some are something else. But then they go into a collaborative governance of the next level, the next layer above, and then those into a further layer above. But it's local system solutions collaboratively designed and implemented by communities who can feel each other, touch each other, talk to each other for the global systemic problems that we are trying to find solutions for.
I actually, the short answer is I don't know, but let me try and pretend that I'll try to answer the thing. See, I think the challenge, Arun, here is that your profits or whatever is the compensation that you give for capital is tangible. Your costs that we are talking of are intangible. And that is where the contradiction comes. When you are able to measure these things more and more, then possibly it is then possible for you to bring a common base on which we all agree. And for example, if you look at how the corporate governance and transparency norms have evolved, and evolution of, how do you deal with MSMEs and pay them within 30 days, your energy conservation requirements, etc., etc. There are multiple ways in which you can look at it. One is self-governance. Second is it a good practice? And third is, can it become a obligation through emission norms and requirements and so on? So I guess there is always this trade-off between tangible and non-tangible. And if we go back and look at the way the world is emerging on these, particularly on the social and MDG or SDG requirements, you would see that we already have some sort of certification agencies that are coming up, conversations around organizations wanting to preserve this thing, but they're few and far between. But I guess it will, for example, the benefit corporations in the US and the process of certification. I mean, as of now, they're moving in two different lines. There's one legislative aspect, the other is certification aspect, and they're not meeting together. But eventually, if we are able to bring some tangible, measurable parameters, it will be easier for us to implement it. Otherwise, it is always going to be complex, because it is your interpretation versus my interpretation. I mean, for example, on every bottle of Aquafina, Pepsi says that we are a water neutral company. We actually contribute more to the water than we extract. Now, globally you could be, but what is happening to the local economy is a question that we need to ask. Are you extracting water here and reinvesting in Brazilian rainforest? And how does that square up with the Kerala, with a village in Kerala? We need to worry about.
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a tangible measurement. Things which can be converted to money very directly, and money itself, it's easy to measure. And that's why the financialization, the discussion we had. I mean, they are able to even move that stuff and measure it and do it digitally. You don't even need to intercede yourself. The computer will do it. But when you talk about, as you say, people's feelings, there's lack of respect for them. And even in the environment, many things can't be just gauged on some simple measurement. It's a combination of things that creates it. So we got to get used to, I think, as scientists, not insisting on mathematical measurement. And this is the problem, I think, that's come by, say, physics and into finance, which become, I think, worse than physics. Physics recognized that you can't measure a thing very accurately. If you try to be too accurate about one aspect of the thing, you lose the possibility of measuring any other aspect of the thing, the waves and particles, the Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty. I do think we are at that moment where just the wisdom of people who say, well, aise lagta hai, I feel it, and so on, that must be part of the measurement. It must be included in it, in the assessment of it. Don't try to convert it to a mathematical equation and to prove. This is the bane of economics, and fortunately, some economics Nobel Prizes are being given the last few years for looking at reality without getting into macroeconomics.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to invite now Professor Veena Agrawal to ask a question and provide comment.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I've been waiting for quite a while, but I guess what was on the chat wasn't in the end. So thank you very much. I really wanted to shift the conversation a little bit. So Professor Shriram, you've presented what I feel are formal cooperatives in a particular sector. But to really understand the potential of cooperation across fields in India or elsewhere, we need to theorize more and conceptualize this, I believe, differently. Now, I've been working on this topic for at least 12 years in numerous ways, but particularly in agriculture. So I'll share some of my insights with you. I feel firstly that we need to focus on cooperation rather than cooperatives, because cooperatives are only one type of collective. Now, cooperation is the basis on which economic theory either agreed or disagreed. So Olson's theory of collective action, where they say people cannot cooperate because they'll free ride, was not focused on cooperatives as an institution, but on the concept of cooperation. And I think that's a very good way to start. Why do we cooperate? Who cooperates? And what scarcities push you to cooperate? Now, I want to submit, and I've written actually several papers on this, that we can have three types of cooperation. what I call single purpose cooperation, which is service cooperatives, whether it's credit or for input purchase or output for marketing. They deal with markets, basically, financial or other markets. Then you can have medium purpose cooperation. So for instance, farmers come together, they invest in a tube well, or they invest in a large lumpy machinery, or they sit down and do ecological planning across ecological zones. But then you can have what I term fully integrated cooperation, which is actually you pull your land, labor, and capital and do, I'm using a descriptive term, which is group farming. Now, the history of, if you take the history of group farming, it actually goes back a long way. So somebody had mentioned, and there have been waves of this. So you had socialist collectivization, which is one form of, which is very top down, very large scale, and it had disastrous effects. But then you also have post-colonial group farms, which is what India tried in sub-Saharan Africa, and Tanzania had the Ujamaa, and we had it in the 60s and 50s and 60s. And that also failed. And I can mention one or two reasons why, because we didn't know we were bringing small and large farmers together, and we weren't using any principles. Then you have post-socialist collectivization in Nicaragua, in East Germany, in Romania. And then we have what are contemporary cooperation and group farming. And you have this, in many parts of India. You have it in Romania, you have it in France, you have it in Ireland, you have it in Norway. What are these? These are small groups of farmers, 3 or 4 to 10, coming together, pulling their land, labor, and capital, and farming together. They have all the principles of voluntary, democratic functioning. People have provide inputs in terms of decision making. They share their costs and they share their benefits. And the principles are based on these principles. There are success stories, because they bring economies of scale, they share hired labor, they, there's a whole range. You can deal with climate change much better. And the empirical examples, which I've studied, for instance, if you take Kerala. Now, Kerala has 68,000 all women's group farms, not 1 or 2 or 10 or 15, 68,000. And they are successful, because I looked at group farms and individual family farms, and group farms were several times more productive and profitable. You find examples in Andhra. And partly from what I wrote, you have cooperatives coming up in Gujarat, small scale, East India, and so on. So what I want to submit is that we need to, India is at a great moment of talking about cooperation in multiple fields. But we need to then conceptually understand them and what is working and not working. And what is certainly working is when you have these principles. And I'm saying this is not just in India. France, 7.5% of France's farms, which is quite a large number, are group farms. 4 or 5 people voluntarily pooling everything together and cultivating. Same in Norway. So I actually attended this in the hope that we could have I know it's very late, we could have a discussion on this, because Amul, I feel, is part of what I call much more within the range of marketing and service cooperatives, and not in terms of fully integrated cooperation. Whereas for full benefits, you really need the latter. So I know it's getting late, I won't spend more time, but I'm also happy to, I'll just put some of these papers on chat and hope this is a continuing conversation. And because it's the time when we're looking at sustainable outcomes, we're talking about cooperation and not societies which could be seen as cooperatives, or the amount of time we spend today talking about structures and so on. I think we should move away from that. The structures will emerge according to the purpose of the cooperation. Right. So I can see people nodding, and that's very nice. But just a brief, just a brief response, because I'm happy to, as I said, share some of this work, and we can have another discussion on it in another time.
Binaji, my own work has been not in the larger field of cooperation. My work has been largely restricted to enterprises. So therefore, it is within my limitation that I spoke. I mean, what you say is absolutely important. And I think there should be a larger discussion on this. I certainly have not worked in that area of larger cooperation. I therefore restricted myself to the end
Yes.
part of the cooperatives. You're absolutely right that there is a larger debate to be had. Absolutely.
But I put my papers on chat. Perhaps within this framework, you might find that the kinds of cooperatives that you've been working on might fit into one element of that. And it might be helpful to conceptualize it more as you felt it was necessary.
Sure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now I would like to invite our students. So Ayush is our MA Economics student and he's keen to ask questions. Ayush, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, so actually my question has been partly answered when Professor Mayer and Professor Agarwal asked their questions. But to carry, I haven't seen that to take terms from system dynamics, we have been overshooting our ecological limits. And we have been moving toward unsustainable system because we are overusing and overutilizing, wasting our natural resources like land and water and so on. So to my mind, I was thinking that perhaps we could move toward cooperative structure of our manufacturing and working and utilize those resources in a manner which will actually increase the efficiency, because in a competitive world where there are so many people, and if they are not using their resources efficiently and there is a hindrance in ability to exit from the market, then they would be continuing their usage of those resources. So what are the limits of such kind of cooperative society or cooperative structure of growth and development? Because at the end of it, I see that perhaps we could move toward as a communist state, as a USSR, and there would be dilution of responsibility and motivation to work in such environment. So how can we actually improve this efficiency and reduce our wastage in such a way?
I think you asked a very complex question, Ayush, and I think you asked the question at multiple levels. See, what is the concept of efficiency itself? And the concept of efficiency is trying to use minimum resources to get the maximum out of it in the most efficient way. I mean, you use efficiency to define efficiency. What do you mean by that? Ultimately, the metric for efficiency turns out to be tangible. How efficient are you? How much of oil do you extract from this nut? Or so, I mean, I don't know how to answer your question, because your question goes beyond the cooperative firm and gets into a larger issue of governance. So, and what is the framework that we need to have as far as governance is concerned, and what is the role of a cooperative enterprise within that? So I guess it's a much larger canvas. I'll just leave it there. I don't think I'm capable of answering that.
No problem, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite Professor Jimo Luni to make some comments, and if she has any questions.
Thanks a lot, Sriram, for that very long and very interesting. And of course, I've heard a lot of those stories a little bit before. But yeah, it's quite a fascinating thing to hear the development of the cooperative movement in India. I just wanted to ask you about the new form of collectives that has been brought into the scene. I think we've not spoken about it. So these producer companies, which is part of the Companies Act now. So what was the impetus? Why did that come in? Because I think Dr. Kurian and Professor Y.K. Alag had roles in that. Why did that come up? And then, just for the larger audience, what is the difference with, what was that advantage they saw in that as compared to a cooperative, or what was the difference? Yeah.
Yeah, this is within my realm of competence concept, so I'll try and answer this. Jimol, I guess for a long time, all of us believed that the bane of cooperatives is the political interference, and that was very evident. So therefore, around 88, 89, the Cooperative Development Foundation, who were my former employers, Dr. Kurian set up something called the Cooperative Initiatives Panel. Mohan Dharia, Dr. Kurian and LC Jain were members of that, which operated out of the IRMA campus in Anand. The whole idea of this was to liberate the cooperative laws from the political clutches. Essentially, the cooperative laws had this boilerplate clause which said that at any given point in time, government could appoint an administrator and take over the operations of the cooperative. So they just wanted the cooperative law to be similar to the Companies Act, wherein you do only registration, dissolution, and seeking of returns and arbitration when people go back to you, but don't interfere in the day-to-day affairs. So there was a large movement for reform of cooperative law, and they found it very, the first reform happened in Andhra Pradesh when the same NTR, who was responsible for taking over the cooperative, passed an alternative legislation called the Mutually Aided Cooperative Societies Act. And the Cooperative Initiatives Panel tried to replicate that act across the states. Now, the story of the farmer producer company is that cooperation is a state subject and the center cannot legislate on it unless it's a multi-state cooperative. So then they had a workaround which said that we will not call it a cooperative, we'll call it a producer company. So if you go back and look at the producer company chapter, it is actually, if you look at the principles of the organization, it's completely cooperative principles, but they don't use the word cooperation at all. So that was one way of working around the tyranny of the state governments as they possibly perceived. So that's the history of the special chapter in the Companies Act. So in essence, if you say what is the difference between a traditional cooperative and a farmers producer organization or the producer company, in principles, there's nothing. But the governance under the producer company architecture gives it a little more flexibility to manage your election process, etc., a little more sophisticated manner. Cooperatives get into much more details. That's the difference.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sriram. I forgot to ask your permission because during question answer, we were also kind of driven away and we did not realize that we have crossed 5:30. So there are a couple of more questions, last question that I would request you to stay. So, so now I would like to invite Parth, one of our MBA students who has a question. Parth, if you can come on camera and ask a question.
Hello, sir,
Yeah.
am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
So sir, my question is that in the budget speech of 2019-20, our finance minister mentioned a concept of social stock market or social stock exchange, which was particularly for not-for-profit organizations. So I was curious about cooperatives, that can we expect cooperatives be listed on stock exchange in future for better transparent model?
Yeah, I mean, Parth, much discussion is happening. I'm trying to get a wrap around this. I've not understood this very well. See, what let us get this conceptual factor a little clearer. There is exchange is what? Exchange is a place where you trade something, right? You have something to sell and something to buy. What is a social stock exchange? So what will you sell and buy? I mean, that is a question. What is it that is being traded? You need to have something to sell and something to this thing. I looked at both the working committee report as well as this thing, but there are some hybrid instruments that they've mentioned that you can trade. So, and there are some mutual funds that they talked about where the dividend goes to a social cause, whereas the fund itself is a social fund. So there are a whole lot of experiments that are being done to bridge this and make it seamless between the corporate world and the social world. So it's an interesting idea. We should engage with all these ideas and see how it evolves. But as of now, at least on the working group report, I thought that there was a little bit of a confusion that the working group had between what could be a registry where you actually go and register your document and say, this is what are the terms and conditions. and an exchange. For example, this suggests a zero coupon, zero principal bond. Now, a zero coupon, zero principal bond in layman's term is a grant, because you're not getting an interest, you don't get the principal back. What is there to trade in that? What is there to list in that? Why would I buy those good feelings that I've invested in an imaginary bond that gives me satisfaction? I think that the ideas are interesting, but they need to be fleshed out, and very clearly we need to ask, since you're in Ahmedabad, you always need to ask the debit and credit question. What is the transaction? How am I going to pass an entry? I think ultimately it has to get reduced to that. Otherwise, the ideas read interesting. I think that needs to be sort of translated much better. Yeah, Sudhir.
Yeah, thank you. Now, for the last question, I would like to invite Professor Pallavi Vyas. She has a question and she would like to ask. If you can unmute yourself, Pallavi. And
hi, thank you so much. Sriram, so just quickly, how come Amul has avoided this political interference? What is in Amul's structure that has allowed them to stay away from political?
About 4 years ago, there was a series of articles in Scroll written by Mr. Rajshekhar, where he claimed that Amul had become Congress Mukt now. So I don't think Amul has avoided politicization, but what it has, this is something that somebody like Arun would be able to throw much more light on. That there is an organizational part of it is design, and that is rules, regulations, how do this thing. But there is an organizational culture which is built over a period of time, and that is imbibed very deeply. And those are not norms set out in rules. They're easily violatable, but somehow people feel difficult to violate those norms. I think one reason why we continue to see Amul as an organization which is not where politicians are not interfering, is essentially because the CEO continues to decide the price of the milk. He doesn't ask anybody to decide the price of the milk. There are a whole lot of other political interferences, but operationally, on a day-to-day basis, I think there is a very strong culture that some of the things are non-negotiable. You shall not poke your nose into it, even if you are my boss, right? I guess Amul has that deep-rooted culture which emanated out of the insulation that Kurian provided during his time. Is there anything that can be done? So it is your question is somewhat like this. How is it that Reserve Bank has not been politicized? You can ask that rhetorical question. How is it that when, bureaucrats whom you think are stooges of the government go to Reserve Bank, suddenly declare independence and seem to be on their own? And Mr. Chidambaram said this is the tyranny of the technocracy of Reserve Bank. So there is something about the internal culture of the organization, and I think that is something which cannot be codified very easily. But if you are able to put that culture for the first 5 to 10 years of the organization, I think it survives for the next 50, 60 years before it withers away. IIM Ahmedabad is a good place, which had the Ravi Mathai imprint. In fact, as long as I worked in IIM Ahmedabad, anything that we would say, long after Mr. Mathai had stepped down, anything we would say, they'd say, no, during Ravi's time, this would not have happened. And Ravi was, Ravi was all pervading there. Not a single picture of his in the campus. So something like that.
thank you so much for this. Now I would like to invite Rahul Singh for any closing remarks or comments.
Thank you, Professor Sriram, for this insightful talk. I learned a lot about cooperatives, had very little idea about them. So it was great for me, and I'm pretty sure for the audience today. Thank you again for taking time on the Saturday for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Nice and a pleasure meeting all of you here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Sriram. And as I always say, that the question answer session is much more interesting than the conversation. And I still firmly believe in that. And that happened. So thanks to everyone. those who joined us, and thanks to you.